By 1864, the Confederacy was clearly dying. Losing Chattanooga had cut the southern capital of Richmond off from everything west of the Appalachian Mountains. Its armies were ragged, hungry, and desertion was rising. The economy was collapsing, and civilians were starving. However, the only thing that mattered was the U.S. presidential election on November 8th. If the South kept fighting and Abraham Lincoln wasn't re-elected, then a diplomatic settlement was still possible. William Tecumseh Sherman had no intention of leaving the war up to the voters. Ulysses S. Grant's promotion to command the military division of the Mississippi vacated his position leading the Army of the Tennessee. Sherman took over, but only had his 15th Corps for the Chattanooga campaign. Following the victory, he marched north to relieve Knoxville. This proved unnecessary as Confederate General James Longstreet lifted the siege immediately after hearing the news from Chattanooga. Sherman finally returned to Vicksburg to formally take command of his army in January 1864. Grant intended to take the department's armies to Atlanta. While technically outside his department, Atlanta wasn't in anyone else's jurisdiction. Moreover, President Lincoln never objected to the vigorous prosecution of the war and would likely favor a campaign against the wealthy southern city. Before the Union armies could march on Atlanta, their rear needed to be secured. After Jackson was destroyed during the Vicksburg campaign, the Mississippi state government relocated to Meridian, which housed an arsenal and all of the surviving regional railway links. Meridian was defended by 10,000 troops near Morton under General Leonidas Polk. The incompetent Polk wasn't a major threat, but Sherman needed practice commanding a large army. Sherman marched from Vicksburg on February 3, 1864, with 20,000 men. He simultaneously ordered his 7,000 cavalry to advance from Memphis, chase Nathan Bedford Forrest's cavalry off, and rendezvous with him in Meridian. His remaining troops feinted in several directions, while naval transports maneuvered near Mobile to draw attention away from Meridian. These deceptions successfully convinced Polk that Sherman's target was Mobile. Rather than hold Morton, he pulled back to Meridian, intending to hit Sherman's rear once he turned toward Mobile. Consequently, he was shocked when Sherman came directly after him and fled into Alabama without a fight. Although Forrest's aggressive attack drove off the superior Union cavalry, attacks on the other feints failed. Sherman occupied Meridian unopposed on February 14th. After destroying everything of military value and freeing Union prisoners, Sherman marched back to Vicksburg on February 20th. An unexpected promotion was waiting for him. Grant had been informed he would soon be made General-in-Chief and promoted to Lieutenant General, the first in the U.S. Army since George Washington. He would need to leave the West for the East. He wanted his friend Sherman to bring his army to Chattanooga and take over the Western Department. When Grant formally received his promotion on March 9, 1864, President Lincoln was in a particularly depressive mood. Certain he would lose re-election, he wanted Grant to either win the war outright before November, thereby ensuring his re-election, or ensure it could be won before a peace candidate took office in March. Grant complied with his signature strategic directness. At this late stage, the only major unconquered Confederate territories were the cities of Mobile, Richmond, and Atlanta. If those cities were taken, the Confederacy would eventually wither and die. However, destroying the Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of Tennessee would win the war outright. Therefore, George Meade and the Army of the Potomac would engage Robert E. Lee, using Richmond to pin him in place and destroy him. Sherman would do the same to the Army of Tennessee by launching an assault on Atlanta. Meanwhile, all other commands would launch supplemental attacks to divert and overwhelm Confederate resources. Each department had discretion in how to complete its objectives, but all movements had to begin between May 1st and 14th.
Grant would finally launch the simultaneous offensive others had theorized about since 1861. Grant provided Sherman with his plans for capturing Atlanta, after which the two were in constant telegraph contact to coordinate their efforts. Grant took Ambrose Burnside and the Ninth Corps back east. Joseph Hooker and his troops, reorganized into the 20th Corps, would stay behind. Sherman would have 7 infantry corps and 4 cavalry divisions across 3 armies to conquer Atlanta. The only viable supply line for both sides through the mountains of northern Georgia was the Western and Atlantic Railroad. Advancing along this route meant contending with Confederate defenses and cavalry raids against the rail network back to the supply hub in Nashville. Because of these perils, Grant envisioned a swift confrontation with the Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of Tennessee in northern Georgia from multiple fronts as quickly as possible. However, Sherman knew he would have difficulty replacing losses due to his long and easily disrupted supply lines. Therefore, he decided to adopt a strategy of maneuver. While there was only one railway through the mountains, numerous roads meant a route past an enemy always existed. He would use his 3 armies to pin down, flank, and envelop his opponent as he inexorably marched to Atlanta.
The Confederate general opposing Sherman's advance was Joseph Johnston. Ever since taking direct command from Braxton Bragg in December, Johnston had worked tirelessly to rebuild the broken Army of Tennessee and had mostly succeeded. While morale never recovered to pre-Chickamauga levels, he restored his 40,000 soldiers' will to fight and found them the best weapons and food available. Polk joined him in late March, and another 15,000 would arrive during May from other Alabama garrisons. With these weary but able soldiers, Johnston had to find a way to halt Sherman's 120,000-strong juggernaut. Richmond wanted Johnston to fight like Lee and take the offensive, but Johnston refused. He knew his generals weren't capable of executing such deceptive, complicated, and bold offensive maneuvers. Even if they could, Sherman was too tenacious to retreat, too smart to be fooled, and had too many troops to destroy. Moreover, Johnston couldn't replace his losses, making open battle exceedingly risky. However, northern Georgia was a natural fortress, so Johnston didn't have to defeat Sherman outright to win the campaign. Johnston was aware of Northern war weariness and that the peace Democrats were gaining strength. If he could deny Sherman a significant victory before November 8th, the ballot box could save the Confederacy. Therefore, he would play for time. To that end, he built a series of fortifications between Chickamauga Creek and Atlanta, planning to hold each position as long as possible before falling back. The hope was that Sherman would assault his positions, grinding his armies down. If not, between natural attrition and constant skirmishing, he would bleed Sherman dry. Johnston also identified sites where Sherman's columns would naturally isolate themselves and planned ambushes. As the Union Army descended upon Georgia, Johnston's inferior Confederate defense force was inadvertently bolstered. The 3-year contracts of the Union Army's veteran 1861 volunteers were starting to expire. The Confederate Congress had indefinitely extended all Confederate enlistments, but the U.S. Congress had not. This meant Sherman's best men were trickling away. While over half would return after furloughs and new recruits would make up the lost numbers, Sherman's department would have problems with total manpower and soldier quality between June and September. There was also bound to be organizational chaos from units leaving and being replaced. While a major inconvenience, Johnston's own manpower deficiencies prevented him from exploiting this temporary weakness. Sherman marched from Chattanooga on May 3rd. Johnston's skirmishers and Joseph Wheeler's cavalry picked at Sherman constantly until he reached Johnston's first line, Rocky Face Ridge, on May 7th. Rather than attack, Sherman ordered George Thomas and John Schofield to demonstrate against Dug and Mill Creek Gaps, while James McPherson snuck through Snake Creek Gap to take Resaca by surprise and trap Johnston.
McPherson successfully swung around the Confederate left, only to find that Resaca was Johnston's first fallback position and was already garrisoned. Rather than assault an unknown position, McPherson pulled back into the gap and alerted Sherman, who disengaged the other armies and marched south on May 10th. Johnston detected Sherman's movement on May 11th and pulled back to Resaca the following day. He had expected Sherman to get past him, but not this quickly. To encourage Sherman to charge his fortifications, Johnston ordered the supply wagons to continue south to the Oostenaula River as if the army was retreating. Sherman believed the ruse, but didn't act as expected. Instead, he ordered his cavalry to use pontoon bridges to get behind Johnston and cut the railroad at Rome. Two corps would engage what Sherman thought was Johnston's right flank to pin him down, while the rest moved into position to set the trap. The operation went ahead at 11 on May 14th, but the infantry quickly discovered they were attacking the center of Johnston's line, not the flank. The surprise encounter was followed by a determined attack which took some forward positions but was halted by 1500. At 1600, Johnston ordered John Bell Hood's corps to counterattack the 4th Corps' exposed left flank. The initial attack pushed through startled defenders until double canister fire and reinforcements repelled it. Limited fighting resumed mid-morning along the whole line on May 15th, with no side gaining an advantage until 1630, when the defenders of Lay's Ferry moved to attack supposedly exposed Federals just as the Federal cavalry arrived and crossed. His supply and retreat line exposed, Johnston withdrew during the night toward Adairsville, having inflicted more casualties than he took. Constant skirmishing resumed as Johnston fell back. Sherman was advancing on too broad a front to hold Adairsville, so Johnston retreated again. The Confederate general expected Sherman to divide his forces between the Kingston and Cassville roads, so he prepared an ambush. William Hardee's corps remained in Kingston, while the other corps moved to Cassville. When Sherman attacked Kingston, the units on his left flank would be isolated and exposed, letting Polk and Hood destroy them as they moved to Cassville. Sherman took the bait, sending all but 2 corps against Hardee. However, he was not punished because Hood failed Johnston. Hood had been supposed to ambush the column while Polk pinned it on May 19th. Instead, he panicked after receiving reports of Federals behind him, actually a cavalry patrol, and retreated to rejoin Polk. Johnston recognized the opportunity had passed. Once Hardee rejoined him, he retreated into the strong defenses of Allatoona Pass.
Johnston's position was far too strong to assault, so Sherman looked for alternatives. The road through Dallas to Marietta looked promising, so Sherman prepared to leave his supply line and flank Johnston along that route. Taking 20 days of supplies, Sherman moved out on May 23rd. However, Wheeler was watching and alerted Johnston, who had anticipated such a move by garrisoning Dallas. Once certain this wasn't a feint, Johnston moved his whole army to block Sherman. Hardee and Polk were in position and had entrenched themselves before Hooker's corps arrived on May 25th. After spending the afternoon scouting, Hooker assaulted the Southerners at New Hope Church around 1700. He was bloodily repulsed after 3 hours of fighting in a thunderstorm. Fueled by his hatred for Hooker, Sherman unfairly chastised his subordinate for delaying the attack, not realizing Johnston had arrived the day before. With his main route blocked, Sherman tried to flank the Confederate right. Ordering Hooker to pin the Confederate center with skirmishing, he sent Oliver Howard's corps to Pickett's Mill and had McPherson's army occupy Dallas. On May 27th, Howard was supposed to send his whole corps against Patrick Cleburne's lone division, but instead only attacked with 1 brigade, which was badly mauled. Bad intelligence led Johnston to launch a failed attack on Dallas on May 28th. Skirmishing continued along the entire line until June 1st, when Sherman's cavalry found Allatoona Pass undefended. Sherman then shifted left, and by June 3rd, Thomas and Schofield's armies were through. Johnston detected the move and withdrew to the defenses around Marietta. June 9th marked the start of a month-long fencing match outside Marietta. Sherman used his numbers to extend his lines and gradually force Johnston out of strong positions, while Johnston bled him in countless skirmishes. On June 14th, while inspecting his lines at Pine Mountain, Sherman spotted senior Confederate officers making a reconnaissance. He directed artillery fire onto them, resulting in an explosive barrage which killed Polk. As Sherman gradually worked Johnston back towards Kennesaw Mountain, the aggressive Hood launched an unauthorized attack at Kolb Farm on June 22nd. Schofield's army was trying to turn Johnston's left, but had halted and dug in after severe rainstorms. Hood suffered heavy casualties in a reckless attack against Federal earthworks. Afterward, Sherman concluded he had become too predictable. Johnston appeared to be anticipating his flanking attempts. Besides, the side roads were nearly impassable due to heavy rain. Therefore, he would do the opposite. Sherman noted that the ridges near Kennesaw Mountain created a natural fortress to which Johnston had added extensive earthworks. However, since Sherman had only used flanking maneuvers, he expected Johnston to have weakened his center to strengthen his wings. Therefore, McPherson and Schofield would demonstrate against the flanks while Thomas assaulted Johnston's center.
At 800 hours on June 27th, a 200-gun barrage pounded the Confederate lines. This assault was the only thing that went according to plan. Johnston immediately determined that McPherson and Schofield were only demonstrating and ignored them. The terrain was far more broken and thickly vegetated than expected, and what was supposed to be a concentrated push at 8:30 became piecemeal assaults along the whole line between 8:30 and 9:30. While Federal forces managed to take the outlying rifle pits, Johnston's breastworks were too strong to breach, and the attack petered out by 11 o'clock. Sherman suffered 3,000 casualties to Johnston's 1,000. This tactical defeat quickly turned into a major strategic victory. Schofield's troops found an unmarked path to Ollie's Creek, and his cavalry division and 2 infantry brigades were across and between Johnston and Atlanta by nightfall. Sherman had Schofield hide in position so as not to alert Johnston before the entire army could join him. More rain delayed the maneuver until July 2nd. Johnston detected the move and retreated behind the Chattahoochee River on July 3rd, the final natural barrier between Sherman and Atlanta, after having held Sherman for only a week. All bridges and normal crossing points across the Chattahoochee were fortified when Sherman arrived on July 5th. A partially burned pontoon bridge was captured at Pace's Ferry, but Confederate fortifications were too strong to attempt a crossing. Sherman called up his own pontoons while looking for unguarded crossings. Despite chest-deep waters, the Chattahoochee's negligible current made it surprisingly fordable. The pontoons arrived on July 8th, and by July 11th, Sherman had established a presence at multiple points. Johnston was down to his last defensive line before Atlanta's outer fortifications. This was also his best planned ambush site. Union troops had to cross Peachtree Creek, where they would be isolated and vulnerable. The attack had to be precisely timed for when sufficient soldiers were both across and in the creek to cause a traffic jam, but before enough crossed to build breastworks. If carried out too early or too late, disaster would follow. However, Johnston never sprung his ambush. President Jefferson Davis hated Johnston and had no patience for his Fabian tactics, while panicked Southern civilians demanded a bold attack to drive Sherman away. In early July, Davis sent his military advisor Braxton Bragg to report on the situation. For reasons unclear, Bragg only spoke extensively with Hood, who angled for Army command by telling Bragg everything Davis wanted to hear. On July 17th, Davis replaced Johnston with Hood, despite objections from the Army's other generals. Robert E. Lee also objected, warning Davis that Hood was too reckless for high command, but Davis didn't listen. This change of command came as a relief to Sherman. Despite appearances, Johnston's strategy was working. Sherman had marched 112,000 out of Chattanooga, facing 50,000 Confederates. After 2 months of attrition and fighting, Sherman had 80,000 to Johnston's replenished force of 50,000. Furthermore, Sherman knew that Johnston would happily endure a siege through November to deny him victory. Conversely, Hood would almost certainly attack recklessly, shattering his army. Victory was now a question of when, not if.
Hood took command on July 18th and decided to execute Johnston's ambush. However, he didn't understand the plan's nuances and botched the assault. Thomas's troops began crossing mid-morning on July 20th, and Hood intended to attack at 1300 hours. However, other Union Army movements caused Hood to shift troops eastward, causing a cascading delay along the line. Hardee further held off attacking until 1600, by which point Thomas was fully across and had fortified his positions. Hardee and Stuart's corps still valiantly charged the Union lines. Hardee made no impact, while Stuart pushed back 2 brigades on the Union flank before being repelled. They inflicted 1,900 casualties, suffering 2,500 of their own. However, it looked as if Hood had stopped Thomas, so the Confederate public cheered the victory. Hood fell back into Atlanta's fortifications on July 21st, but defending wasn't his style. Still determined to attack, he withdrew from the outer defenses, hoping Sherman would rush in and be crushed in a flank attack. Instead, Sherman methodically began cutting Atlanta's railways to the east and west. Thinking he could turn McPherson's flank, cut Sherman's supply lines, and force him to retreat, Hood attacked again on July 22nd. Hood planned for Benjamin Cheatham to pin the Union front while Hardee swung around the flank and Wheeler destroyed the supply base in Decatur. Both flanking movements took far longer than planned, and McPherson detected the movement. After sending his reserves forward to meet the attack, McPherson rode forward to join them, only to ride into Confederate skirmishers who killed him. The initial attack was easily repulsed, but Confederate persistence pushed back the Union left until it was stopped at Bald Hill. Attacks along the Georgia Railroad made a small breakthrough, but were repelled by artillery. Wheeler pushed Union infantry back into Decatur, but never threatened the supply depot and retreated by 1700 hours. Again, the Confederate press celebrated Hood stopping Sherman, despite suffering 5,500 casualties to 3,722. In reality, Sherman was already as far east as he intended to go. Sherman put Atlanta's defenders under a 24-hour artillery bombardment while gradually enveloping the city. On July 27th, Howard was redeployed from the east flank to the west to cut the last railway into Atlanta, the Macon and Western. Hood spotted the redeploying Federals and sent 2 corps to stop them. However, Howard anticipated this attack and stopped to dig in at Ezra Church by 1100 hours on July 28th. His men were rested and ready when the rebels arrived that afternoon. Wrongly thinking they had surprise in numbers on their side, the Confederates charged without reconnaissance or coordination. They never threatened Howard's trench line and were slaughtered, suffering over 3,000 casualties while inflicting only 642. The Army of Tennessee had suffered more casualties in 10 days under Hood than it had in 2 months under Johnston.
Sherman didn't rush the siege. Throughout August, he continued the bombardment while trying to cut Atlanta's supply lines. Cavalry was continually sent around Hood, but suffered heavy casualties for minor disruptions. Wheeler raided Sherman's lines and suffered equally. By the end of August, Sherman concluded that immediate and dramatic action was needed to take Atlanta. Northern morale had soared during May and June as he and Grant marched south, but it had cratered as they stalled through July and August. This slowdown allowed the Peace Democrats to force an immediate ceasefire plank into their party platform. Sherman understood he could afford no more dithering. On August 25th, Sherman pulled everyone but Schofield out of position and prepared to march. His armies would shift around Hood's left flank and physically block the Macon and Western, finally isolating Atlanta. Hood detected movement on August 28th, but didn't know if Sherman was retreating or advancing on Macon, so he did nothing. Finally realizing what Sherman was doing at 18 on August 30th, Hood rushed 2 corps under Hardee to Jonesboro with orders to swiftly attack the next day. On 9 a.m. on August 31st, Howard discovered Hardee's position in Jonesboro and pulled back to build fortifications while waiting for Thomas to arrive. Hardee waited until all his troops arrived around 15 before following Hood's orders to attack with bayonets fixed in echelon from left to right. Half of Hardee's divisions charged into a storm of Federal lead and were repulsed before he called off further attacks, having suffered 1,700 casualties and inflicted only 179.
Following this disastrous skirmish, Hood understood that Atlanta was lost. Hardee's most engaged corps was withdrawn to help prepare the evacuation as Hardee delayed Sherman's advance. Union forces advanced the following morning, destroying the railroad until they hit Hardee's line. In confused fighting, the Confederates suffered 1,400 casualties versus 1,200 Union losses. That night, Hood abandoned Atlanta for rough and ready, burning all military buildings and 81 boxcars filled with ammunition that couldn't be moved. The resulting explosions caused the fire to spread rapidly. Sherman entered a smoldering Atlanta on September 2nd, telegraphing Lincoln, "Atlanta is ours and fairly won." This victory restored Union morale and ensured Lincoln's landslide re-election, dooming the Confederacy.
For the next 2 weeks, Sherman consolidated his victory. Atlanta was useless to him and needed to be abandoned, so he expelled the remaining civilian population to secure his rear. Meanwhile, President Davis visited Hood, and the two hatched an insane plan to save their doomed cause. Hood would swing around Sherman, liberate Chattanooga, gather supplies and fresh recruits, defeat Sherman, continue to Nashville, and then turn east to link up with Lee and drive off Grant. This harebrained scheme was a manifestation of Davis's delusional optimism. Hood was too concerned with keeping the president happy to object. Whatever minuscule chance the plan had was ruined when Davis touted it during speeches in Richmond, destroying any element of surprise. Sherman smirked at the absurdity, even more so when Hood began marching on September 18th. George Thomas was sent back to Nashville to organize defenses, while Sherman half-heartedly chased Hood into Alabama. He then sent 3 corps to Thomas, keeping 4 corps for his next campaign. When Sherman first proposed his plan to Grant, the latter had balked. Sherman proposed to cut loose from his supply lines and march across Georgia to Savannah, foraging for supplies, and destroying anything of military value to break Southern morale. While Grant did not doubt Sherman could scavenge enough food, he was concerned about his peer cutting himself off from reinforcements and communication with an enemy army nearby. However, with Hood off on a fool's errand, Grant approved the plan. On November 15th, Sherman burned everything of military value in Atlanta and marched out with 62,000 men in 2 columns. Proceeding along a front between 10 and 50 miles wide, Sherman's troops scorched the earth of Georgia. While provost marshals were ordered to summarily hang anyone found harming civilians, all Confederate property was fair game. The foraging bummers left nothing in their wake. Railroads were torn up, bridges and telegraph lines torn down, and plantations looted and burned. Over 22,000 head of livestock and 20 million tons of food and fodder were hauled off. The last supply base of the Confederacy was utterly destroyed. Wheeler and Hardee remained to oppose Sherman, but could never concentrate more than 13,000 men in his path to effectively resist. As Sherman neared Savannah, Hardee pulled every able-bodied soldier out of the city and fled north. Sherman delivered the city to Lincoln as a Christmas present on December 26th. The Confederate collapse was now imminent.